There are constructions that defy gravity. Others defy history. But there are some that challenge even today's engineers, men and women with access to supercomputers, modeling software and technologies that the ancients could never imagine. So, how can we explain structures described in the Bible that until now, no one has been able to reproduce with complete certainty? Can you imagine ziggurats that touched the sky, temples so precise that not even the sound of tools could be heard, and an ark so strong that it withstood the collapse of the world? What kind of wisdom was poured into these works? Were they just symbols, or codes of divine knowledge that spanned millennia? What you're about to see isn't just a list of impressive buildings. It's a journey through sacred monuments that test the limits of science and faith. And in the end, perhaps you will discover that not all engineering is born from calculation. Some are born from obedience to something that the modern world is still trying to decipher. At the heart of humanity's oldest stories are stories that seem to defy not only faith, but also logic, science, and, above all, engineering. Constructions described in meticulous detail, built by people who, in the light of conventional history, would not have access to tools, calculations, or technologies to carry out such feats. Even so, these structures existed, or at least their reports have survived time with enough strength to provoke archaeologists, architects, and engineers to this day. If topics like this intrigue you as much as they challenge us, subscribe to the channel. Here each ancient story reveals hidden layers that continue to influence the world we are building today. Few images arouse as much fascination as that of the Tower of Babel. The narrative tells of a united people with a single language determined to build a tower so high that it would touch the heavens. It was not just about height, but about a project of colossal proportions, centralized, coordinated, and ambitious. In the middle of ancient Mesopotamia, there is evidence that structures of this type were actually started. Ziggurats, like the one at Etamananki, were built with baked bricks and bitumen, a type of natural asphalt. These stepped monuments reached impressive heights by the standards of the time, and served not only as places of worship, but also as symbols of technological power. The biblical description, however, goes beyond visible engineering. It introduces a disruptive idea, the fragmentation of languages as a direct consequence of absolute centralization. The project fails not due to structural limitations, but due to a communicational collapse. And this is precisely where the comparison with the modern world becomes inevitable. In a time where global data systems, neural networks, and multilingual platforms interconnect billions of people, the Tower of Babel stops being just a mythological ruin and becomes a mirror of our reality. What happens when a single framework tries to unify everything? When is diversity seen as an obstacle and standardization as a virtue? Current engineers, accustomed to dealing with international standards and global production scales, recognize the complexity involved in centralized projects in multicultural environments. Communication between areas, technical language, local interpretations of standards, all of this can be a point of failure in a large-scale system. The Tower of Babel didn't fall because they didn't know how to build it. It collapsed because they underestimated the human factor. Modern architecture, even with its advanced technologies, still stumbles upon the same dilemmas. Smart city projects, for example, face logistical and cultural challenges reminiscent of Babel. Automated systems, when not understood by everyone involved, become vulnerable. Language, in this context, ceases to be a tool of expression and becomes the invisible foundation of any collective construction. Meanwhile, archaeologists continue to excavate ancient ruins in regions such as modern-day Iraq, looking for fragments of ziggurats that may have inspired the Babel narrative. And even without direct physical evidence of the tower, as described in the biblical text, the symbolic impact of the story continues to reverberate. It's not just about stones stacked towards the sky, but about the daring to challenge human limits with technique, coordination, and ambition. The Tower of Babel is not only remembered for what it built, but for what it collapsed. It reminds us that behind any monumental work, There is a system of human relations as complex as the structural calculations that support it. And this, perhaps, is the most underrated aspect of engineering. The understanding that, before any machine or tool, communication is the first building material. Centering around an ideal, as in the case of the Tower of Babel, is a force that drives both progress and collapse. This tenuous balance between the power of union and the risk of pride is also manifested in another biblical construction, whose echoes still resonate in architectural treatises, historical debates, and archaeological investigations. Solomon's temple, described as one of the grandest achievements of ancient Jerusalem, the temple was not just a place of worship, but a concrete symbol of national stability, spiritual identity, and sophisticated technical knowledge. Unlike the Tower of Babel, which sought to reach the heavens in an act of collective ambition, the temple sought to concentrate the divine in a carefully delimited physical space. Each measurement, each material, each artifact positioned there carried layers of meaning. The temple was built in the 1950s BC, at a time when the Kingdom of Israel reached the height of its political and economic organization. And yet, even with centralized resources, construction involved a colossal effort. The use of cedars from Lebanon, sent by Hiram, king of Tyre, was not only an aesthetic choice, but also a strategic decision. This type of wood was extremely resistant, valued for its durability and ability to withstand climate variations, something crucial for structures that were expected to last centuries. The stones used were cut directly in the quarries, shaped so precisely that, according to reports, no sound of hammers or tools was heard on site during assembly. All the preparation was done beforehand, as if the process itself followed a sacred rhythm. Engineers and architects studying the temple's design are impressed by the millimetric precision mentioned in ancient texts. There are calculations related to the golden proportions, sacred geometry, and the arrangement of internal spaces that indicate an advanced level of architectural knowledge. The Holy of Holies, for example, was a perfect cube, which not only had symbolic implications, but also demonstrated a mastery of geometry that few people had consolidated at that time. The organization of space followed patterns that would later be reused in various architectural traditions, from Mayan temples to Gothic cathedrals, indicating a universal archetype of sacralization of space. But what most intrigues contemporary scholars is not just the building itself, but the idea that the temple was somehow a conduit between heaven and earth, not in a mystical or theological sense, but as a symbolic device that attempted to materialize the invisible. Its architecture was not just physical, but spiritual. Every square inch seemed to fulfill a greater purpose. This raises profound questions about the function of engineering. Does it serve only to solve technical problems, or also to translate abstract dimensions of human existence? In modern times, architectural projects such as the Hiroshima Memorial, the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, or the UN headquarters in New York seek to translate ideas into form. These are constructions that want more than to be useful or beautiful. They want to represent something that goes beyond their structure. In this sense, Solomon's Temple can be seen as one of the first examples of this symbolic engineering, a space where the function was not limited to physical use but expanded to the invisible, the intangible, the sacred. Interestingly, although the original temple was destroyed, its memory remains one of the most vivid in biblical history. And this reveals another powerful aspect of ancient engineering: the ability to design something so significant that it continues to exist even after it physically disappears. The temple survives as an idea, as an architectural plan described in the texts, as a national nostalgia, and as an inspiration for new attempts at recreation. After all, they have been trying to rebuild it for centuries, not just in stone, but in discourse, in politics, in collective desire. Given this, what still challenges engineers and historians is not just how the temple was built, but how it managed to condense so much symbolic, mathematical, cultural, and spiritual information into its plan. A work that surpassed the limits of traditional engineering, and began to operate in a dimension where calculation and mystery go hand in hand. If Solomon's temple represents the dominance of static form and symbology, the next construction breaks with this rigidity by proposing something unprecedented: the engineering of survival in movement. Noah's Ark, often seen as a children's fable or a religious myth, carries in its dimensions a complexity that, even today, intrigues scholars of naval engineering and hydrodynamics. What is described there is not an ordinary boat, nor is it a light allegory. It is a large-scale project designed to face a total catastrophe. According to the biblical account, Noah received detailed instructions for building an ark with specific proportions: 300 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. Converting these measurements to the current metric system, we have a vessel over 130 meters long. This proportion was not chosen at random. In 2014, a group of naval engineers from South Korea conducted hydrodynamic simulations based on measurements described in Genesis and concluded that the shape of the ark was highly stable, ideal for floating in turbulent waters, even if it was not efficient for navigation. It was not designed to get anywhere, but to endure destruction. The engineering behind this concept is extraordinary. Unlike modern ships, which prioritize propulsion, maneuverability, and speed, Noah's Ark is more similar to a large floating container, whose priority was structural integrity and carrying capacity. It is estimated that, based on the dimensions provided, it would be possible to accommodate thousands of tons of cargo. The challenge, however, was not just physical. There was the issue of weight distribution, ventilation, drinking water supply, and waste containment, factors that even today require advanced logistical planning. If you've made it this far, it's because this content has awakened something beyond curiosity in you. Then write in the comments, "Sacred Engineering." This way I will know that you are part of the group that sees beyond the stones and structures, and understands that every great construction carries an invisible purpose. Interestingly, the idea of building mobile shelters to withstand extreme events is not exclusive to biblical tradition. Ancestral cultures such as the Sumerians, Egyptians, and even Nordic people recorded the existence of floating structures to survive catastrophic floods. This convergence raises the hypothesis that such stories may be based on real events. Perhaps a large regional flood transformed into myth over time. Engineering, in this context, functions as a bridge between narrative and possibility. And even if one accepts the ark as a symbol, the symbol itself carries powerful technical and existential lessons. Construction was not just a way to escape destruction, but to preserve it. The engineering that saves lives is not the one that resists time, but the one that adapts to it. This concept has deep echoes in areas such as emergency architecture, temporary structures for refugees, and rescue vehicles. In all these cases, the priority is not aesthetics, but extreme functionality in adverse conditions. It is crisis engineering, made for situations in which there is no room for failure. Furthermore, the Ark project reflects on the role of knowledge in times of collapse. Noah was not an engineer, at least not in conventional terms, but he followed precise instructions and applied a type of knowledge that, in some way, anticipated modern concepts. This suggests that technical knowledge does not need to come only from formal academies. There is practical, empirical, intuitive intelligence, which reveals itself in critical moments. Today, with the advancement of artificial intelligence and automation, many engineering projects are being carried out with the help of systems that also operate outside traditional understanding. And once again, we return to the idea of an external mind guiding the building hand. Noah's Ark, therefore, is not just a story about salvation. It is a rudimentary treatise on logistics, planning, and resistance. A structure designed to maintain life in its broadest form, without distinctions, in the midst of absolute chaos. And this, for any engineer, is not just a biblical narrative, but a design challenge on a planetary scale. If Noah's Ark represents the engineering of preservation, in the midst of collapse, another biblical construction seems to address the opposite. How to destroy what seemed indestructible. The walls of Jericho, described in the Old Testament as one of the most solid defensive systems of its time, were the scene of one of the most disconcerting episodes in ancient history. According to the report, the walls were not breached by battering rams, catapults, or fire, but by a silent siege, 7 laps around the city and the blowing of trumpets. What could sound like a purely symbolic narrative has, however, aroused the interest of acoustics, structural engineering, and archaeology scholars for decades. The city of Jericho is one of the oldest in the world, with records of occupation dating back to the 9th millennium BC. Their defenses were not improvised. Archaeologists identified that the city had walls more than 5 meters high and 2 meters thick, supported on stone foundations and covered with compacted clay bricks. This structure at the time represented a true feat of defensive engineering, capable of resisting direct attacks for long periods. The city was strategically located and had a considerable topographical advantage. Everything indicated that it would be a difficult territory to conquer. The abrupt fall of these walls, as described in the Bible, has always provoked skepticism and curiosity. During excavations led by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s, layers of destruction were discovered, including signs of abrupt wall collapse and intense burning. The curious thing is that the archaeological records are not completely contradictory to the narrative. Some evidence points to a collapse of the structures that would have occurred from the inside out, something unusual in traditional military sieges. Furthermore, no traces of battering rams or heavy weapons were found, raising the possibility that the collapse occurred by other means. This is where an intriguing theory comes in, that of acoustic resonance. In modern laboratories, scientists have demonstrated that structures can be compromised by sound waves if they are generated at certain frequencies. There are records of metal bridges that collapsed due to unintentional harmonic vibrations, such as the famous case of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in 1940. The principle is simple but powerful. Every structure has a natural frequency. If this frequency is reached accurately and maintained long enough, the structure can collapse without any direct physical impact. Although it is unlikely that the Hebrews of the time had formal knowledge of this phenomenon, it cannot be ignored that the use of instruments such as horn trumpets and rhythmic movement around the walls produced a type of repetitive pressure. Even if it was not enough to completely collapse a wall, it could have contributed to weakening structures already compromised by internal failures, soil instability, or accumulated wear. Archaeology suggests that Jericho was located in an area of moderate seismic activity. A precise vibration, combined with unstable ground, could have been the trigger for a sudden collapse. Regardless of the exact physical explanation, what stands out about this episode is the inversion of expectations. A fortified city, relying on its visible barriers, is defeated by a group that apparently uses no weapons. The engineering of destruction happens not by force, but by repetition, sound, and synchrony. This idea resonates with modern concepts of cyber warfare, where entire systems are brought down by nearly invisible attacks based not on brute force, but on precisely exploited structural flaws. The walls of Jericho, then, transcend the concept of construction. They become the symbol of human trust placed in physical structures as absolute guarantees of security. But history, both ancient and contemporary, shows that what seems indestructible can crumble in the face of invisible, subtle, but incredibly powerful forces. Whether it's an imperceptible vibration, a repeated sound, or a miscommunication, true vulnerability is rarely where you expect it to be, and engineering in this context is not just the art of building walls, but also the in-depth study of how and why they fall. While the walls of Jericho demonstrate that no structure is invulnerable, there is another type of construction that challenges the very notion of permanence. It is the Tabernacle, a mobile structure made to be assembled and disassembled during the crossing of the desert, but with a degree of detail, precision, and symbolism that rivals any fixed building of antiquity. Unlike Solomon's temple, which was designed for a specific location and with permanent foundations, The tabernacle needed to be functional, portable, and sacred at the same time. This combination poses logistical and conceptual challenges that still impress architects and engineers specializing in modular structures. During the period in which the Hebrews wandered in the desert, it is estimated that the tabernacle was transported for dozens of years, constantly being erected in different locations. It was a tent, but not a simple tent. The biblical description reveals a project meticulously divided into areas with distinct functions, such as the outer courtyard, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. Each area had exact measurements, specific fabrics, sacred utensils, and transportation, systems that included rings, clotheslines, and gold-coated wooden supports. This degree of detail, recorded in detail in the Book of Exodus, reveals engineering designed not only to last, but to be reproduced accurately in any environment, maintaining the integrity of the sacred space regardless of external circumstances. The concept of modularity is central to this project. Each element was built with the intention of being assembled and disassembled quickly, without losing functionality or sacrificing stability. This requires a high level of prior planning, quality, control, and standardization, elements that would only be formally systematized in modern architecture centuries later. Today, modular structures are used in situations that demand efficiency and mobility, such as field hospitals, humanitarian camps, mobile military bases, and even sustainable housing in isolated regions. In all these cases, what is sought is exactly what the tabernacle already presented: resistance, adaptability, agile assembly, and respect for the proposed use. Another fascinating aspect of the tabernacle is the choice of materials. Noble fabrics such as fine linen, resistant animal skins, and acacia wood, known for its durability and lightness, were used. The metals used were bronze and gold, distributed with symbolic rigor. Bronze in the external areas, accessible to the people, and gold in the internal parts, reserved for the divine presence. This distribution created not only a visual and aesthetic gradient, but also a spatial hierarchy that reinforced the sensorial and spiritual experience of those who crossed the interior of the structure. Contemporary engineers who analyze these descriptions are faced with a challenge: how to build something so complex, rich in details, symbolism, and function, with the resources available in the middle of the desert. The logistics of transporting, storing, assembling, and maintaining a system like this would require precise organization. Even with the hypothesis that specialized artisans were among the Hebrews, the continued functioning of the tabernacle in hostile environments under intense heat, wind, and dust reveals empirical knowledge about materials and construction techniques adapted to the climate and mobility. In addition to the technical aspect, the tabernacle proposes a profound vision of the role of built space in human life. Instead of being a static monument, it moves with the people. He follows your pains, uncertainties, advances, and setbacks. Its existence reminds us that the sacred is not only in great stone temples, but can inhabit transient, fragile, flexible structures. This understanding breaks the logic of monumentality as the only path to architectural relevance and brings to light a more human, more adaptable, and perhaps more realistic perspective of what it means to build with purpose. Today, the debate about mobile housing, temporary cities, and nomadic architecture is gaining momentum in a world in constant displacement. Environmental refugees, populations on the move, and even digital workers demand structures that are not only functional, but also capable of transmitting belonging and dignity. The tabernacle, with its spiritual and practical engineering, offers an ancient example of how this can be done. It's not just about setting up tents, but about creating spaces where even the transitory can become eternal. If the tabernacle taught that even the sacred can be transported, assembled, and dismantled without losing its essence, there are other constructions mentioned in the biblical texts that, although less extensive in description, still carry an immense technical and symbolic weight. Among them, two stand out for their silent complexity: the Ark of the Covenant and the Pool of Siloam. Both challenge engineers and archaeologists not because of the grandeur of their dimensions, but because of the density of meanings and the technical questions they raise. To this day, the Ark of the Covenant was, at first glance, a small object, an acacia wood box coated with pure gold inside and out, with rings and rods to be transported without direct touching. However, its impact is far from being proportional to its size. The description details the measurements, materials, the cherubs molded into the lid, and the requirement that no one other than designated priests touch it, and even those, under strict protocols. There are biblical records that those who improperly touched the ark died instantly, which has caused many modern scholars to speculate about the possibility that it harbored some type of electrical discharge, electromagnetic field, or in symbolic terms, a concentrated energy channeled through its structure. Some theoretical engineers and physicists speculate that the ark could function as a rudimentary capacitor, storing energy through the conductive and insulating materials present in its construction. Acacia wood would function as an insulator, gold as a conductor, and the combination could, in theory, generate and store a significant electrostatic charge. Evidently, there is no material proof of this, and most of these hypotheses are based on hypothetical reconstructions and modern experimental logic. Still, the fact that such an ancient description contains details that resemble principles of electricity intrigues any analytical mind. The function of the ark was not just symbolic. She was taken at the front of the armies. She was positioned at the center of decisions, in the most sacred point of the Tabernacle and later the Temple. Their power, whether real or perceived, influenced the political and spiritual structure of the people. This multifunctional role of the ark reveals a little-addressed facet of ancient engineering, the intertwining between technology, ritual, and authority. In many cultures, objects of power were constructed with specific materials, precise shapes, and were enveloped by a ritualistic rigor that, in essence, controlled their access and, therefore, their use. The ark, in this sense, was more than a box. It was a symbolic and practical gravitational center. In contrast to this object of concentrated power, there is the Pool of Siloam, a space with a communal and accessible function. Discovered more widely in the early 20th century and confirmed archaeologically in recent decades, it was part of a complex hydraulic system in Jerusalem, fed by Hezekiah's tunnel, a work excavated by hand through solid rock to redirect water from the Gihon spring. The precision with which the tunnel was dug is impressive. Two teams started from opposite sides and managed to meet in the center with minimal deviation. This would require, even by modern standards, a very high degree of planning, measurement, and execution. The Pool of Siloam was used both for water supply and for purification rituals. It represented the integration between public infrastructure and religious function, something that rarely appears with this clarity in ancient buildings. This multiple use of engineering, where utility, spirituality, and collective health intertwine, shows that the ancients understood water as something more than a physical resource. It was also a symbol of renewal, an element of reconnection between the body and the sacred. This type of construction, apparently simple, continues to inspire modern solutions. In regions of water scarcity, water capture and distribution projects, based on gravity and the intelligent use of relief, have proven to be more effective than complex mechanized systems. The lessons of work such as the Hezekiah Tunnel and the Pool of Siloam are not just in their existence, but in the way they integrated engineering with the environment, with everyday life, and with the transcendent. Looking at these constructions together, it is possible to see that the Bible does not just present theological reports or epic narratives. It is also a repository of structural ideas, adaptive engineering concepts, modularity, logistics, acoustics, hydraulics, and even principles that echo electrophysics. When these reports are read without the reductionist filter of miracle or simplistic allegory, they reveal a fertile field of technical and symbolic analysis. After all, building in the biblical context was never just about erecting something material. It was, above all, establishing connection, purpose, and permanence. And that's why these structures, real or symbolic, continue to challenge today's experts. They are not just in the pages of ancient manuscripts, but in our doubts, our projects, and in the questions that we continue trying to answer with science, art, and faith.